Okay, before we start then I'll just read through our usual notices. So, Bore da pawb, good morning everybody. Welcome to everybody attending here and anybody watching via the webcast. Just a reminder that as we're all being filmed on the webcast and that will be available on archive, there's no need for any other filming of the meeting to take place. But please do remember that when other people around you are on camera, you likely will be too. And remember to speak clearly into your microphones. If a fire alarm sounds, follow the green signs out to the Civic Car Park. We welcome the use of Welsh language at our meetings, but as I've received no requests to speak Welsh today, this meeting will be conducted in English only. And can I ask that all mobile phones and any other noise devices be turned on to silent? And finally, if we have any motions put forward during the meeting, I'll need them to be clear and preferably in writing before they go to the vote. Okay, so if we move on to the agenda proper, we're starting on item 1 is attendance. The register is going around the room. Item 2 is apologies for absence. Do we have any?
Yes, apologies from Councillor Ron Burnett, Giles Davis, Cathy Evans, Stuart Evans, Elizabeth Haynes, Alan Jones and Richard Overton.
Members, are there any others you know of? No. Okay, item 3 is declarations of interest, so I'll ask Alice to advise us.
Thank you, Presiding Member. I'm not aware of any interest to be declared, but I'd just like to remind members to be careful to ensure that individuals are not identified or capable of being identified when you have any discussions relating to rough sleepers. Thank you.
Thank you. Members, are there any other declarations anyone wishes to declare? If any come up during the meeting, just remember to write them in on the form in the attendance register. Okay, we go on to agenda item 4 then, which is rough sleeping, on page 3 of the agenda, and the report is going to be presented by Simon Rose.
Good morning. It's actually great to be back in Torfaen. I've been here for around about 12 weeks now. I left in 2006, and there are some faces I do remember, some faces that have been very familiar to me, and hopefully people remember me in a positive light. The truth will be to be had over the next few years that I'm here, I'm sure. The report that's been drafted, rather than go through that verbatim in a way, the presentation that I've done really picks up on a lot of the themes that are in that report and pulls out a number of other things that are there that I'd like to go over. What I'd be suggesting is that if members would be agreeable, is that I just go through the presentation that I have as a way of going through that report and pulling the salient points out of that and then open that up towards the end for any questions that may then arise. We have colleagues here from Cornerstone who can answer one or two specific points around what work is done in terms of helping people who are sleeping rough, but there are a number of things that I'll be going through which will hopefully alleviate some of the concerns that members may well have. In terms of the way forward, what I propose to do is go through the presentation that I have then, and then pick up on any points towards the end of that members may well feel needs clarification or may well want further questions on. Okay. So there's a deliberate mistake at the very outset there. I've got the year on the slide. So apologies there, I'm still in 2019. But going forward, just looking, changing times, housing services in Torfaen have changed significantly in recent months. There's been a restructure, hence my arrival back in Torfaen. And just by way of a précis of an introduction to myself, is my background is predominantly in homelessness. I've managed homelessness services in Torfaen, in Newport, for over 20 years. And I worked very, very closely with Welsh Government on national groups that led to the formation of the legislation as it is now, which I'll go through in a second, together with working on things around Housing First, working around housing support grants and the introduction of that. And I've sat on numerous meetings with various ministers from Welsh Government and officers in delivering the change programme that's been there across Welsh Government to where we are today. So that's a little bit about my background and probably what I've been up to, mainly since I left Holbein in 2006. So, there's a number of things that have been happening nationally, really. There's a national housing network, which I've chaired probably for the last 6 or 7 years, which looks predominantly at housing and homelessness and supporting people, housing support grant as it will be now known. And that group has run across the 22 local authorities to deliver, in partnership with Welsh Government, change across homelessness and supporting people agendas, linking into a range of other things that are available across other service areas such as social care, education, health, probation, etc. So that network is something that I've been fundamentally involved in, and equally Torfaen have been heavily involved in delivering. There's also been a Housing First network that's been established that I sit on, which has delivered, if you like, a number of key things that would determine whether a project is badged as Housing First. So there's a framework that's been put in place by Welsh Government and key agencies across Wales in terms of determining what Housing First looks like, what it actually means. Because there is some confusion. I'll pick up on that in a second. Housing Support Grant I just touched on. There's a group that has been delivering the changes towards integrating the different grant streams that are there in terms of supporting people. The funding that goes in, the very small pot of funding that goes into assisting with the implementation of Rent Smart Wales, but also then the homeless prevention grant that the authority receives every year. Now that is going into one pot, which will give us greater strategic direction in terms of delivering the changes that we're looking to do going forward to address this and other issues around homelessness. What I would say after being back for around about 10, 12 weeks is we have a very, very experienced staff pool. I've been absolutely amazed at the dedication, firstly, that officers have and the way in which they work with people. They really get how to work, how to get the best out of situations that are there, how to actually see beyond the very basics that are in place, in terms of not just looking at the legislation that needs to be followed, but also thinking outside the box. And that doesn't just go for the housing staff, that goes for other staff across all the other agencies as well. There's a real commitment to make that difference. And those providers that I've been working with and that I've met with have really impressed me with their desire to make that difference. So Cornerstone are one example. There's a number of other agencies that have now come into the borough, such as the Woolwich. The Woolwich have a proven track record of working with individuals who are marginalised, who are rough sleeping, but also delivering real true partnerships with local authorities. And that for me is critical, and hopefully that will come through in the presentation I'm doing, but also the report as well that you will have read. So moving on, just a whistle-stop tour of the legislation. Now, I was involved in the group that drafted together the legislation with Welsh Government, along with a number of other officers across Wales, going back to something like 2013. The Act came into effect in 2015, April 2015, and changed fundamentally how homeless legislation looks, how it felt, how it worked. It was a much more person-centred approach. Previously, it was very much, and very crudely, a conveyor belt. People jumped through different hoops to get to the end result of being owed a full housing duty. And there was very little there in terms of the full obligations that local authorities should have been undertaking, in my view, and they were doing in many respects, around seeking to prevent homelessness early. Now, homeless prevention, which is at the heart of this legislation, didn't just come in 2015. It had been worked out for a great number of years, a vast number of years, but it had been done on an informal level. It wasn't done on a statutory level, and the funding necessarily wasn't there to do it. This changed with the legislation, because what the different elements of the legislation say is that everybody is entitled, irrespective of who they are, to basic advice and assistance. So that could be anybody presenting to the local authority. So fundamentally, that's where things start. Where there's a identified risk of homelessness, or where somebody's homeless, triggers two duties. Firstly, if somebody's at risk of homelessness within 56 days, local authorities have a duty, and it is a duty, to seek to prevent homelessness where they practically can. So it's to look at how how those individuals can be assisted to either sustain accommodation or source alternative accommodation to stop them becoming homeless in the first instance. Section 68 kicks in, where individuals then have a vulnerability. So the vulnerability test still arises, which is often referred to as priority need, and local authorities must provide temporary accommodation for those individuals. So a typical example would be somebody with children, somebody who's pregnant, a young person under the age of 18. And that temporary accommodation needs to be provided, it needs to meet certain standards. At that stage, if somebody is physically homeless, irrespective of whether we've got them in temporary accommodation or not, local authorities have a duty to help to secure, it's referred to as the relief duty, help to secure accommodation for individuals. So that could be help to access accommodation through a home seeker, it could be to access supported housing, it could be to access accommodation with maybe friends and relatives, or maybe help to access private rented accommodation. So a whole raft of things in terms of what can be done. If we reach the end of the situation whereby we've got somebody who is vulnerable and they're still homeless and we've not been able to provide a solution, within 56 days we have to look at securing settled accommodation where an individual hasn't contributed to their own homelessness. They failed to pay their rent when they knew that if they didn't pay their rent, they would become homeless. Okay. Fundamentally, throughout this whole process, is that if somebody is eligible for help under any of these sections, we as a local authority, and all local authorities in my view, undertake every action they reasonably can to seek to resolve the housing problems that individuals have. I would heavily caveat that in the sense that that is wholly dependent on individuals cooperating with officers and the authority and partners in delivering those outcomes that are there. If people don't engage, which is a key issue, and it's referenced in the report, there's very little we can do about that other than seeking to try and re-engage with individuals. If somebody doesn't want to undertake the actions we're suggesting, we have very little chance of securing and succeeding in sustaining accommodation. Again, as I've said, I've touched on Section 60. It is really important to note that Section 60 is to provide advice and assistance to anyone, irrespective. It could just be a general phone call into the office just to say, how do I access housing? What are my options? And there may be no risk to homelessness, but we have to give that advice. Okay, so how do we do prevention? This shouldn't be any different in any local authority in Wales, and I suggest even in the UK, because they all, even in England now, through the Homeless Reduction Act, they're operating a very, very similar framework. They've followed Wales. They've followed the Welsh model to a degree. They've made some tweaks and differences, but ultimately it is about that first point of contact, getting it right at the first point. So where we have somebody who's at risk of homelessness or actually homeless, we will seek to contact them on the same day where we practically can. There will be instances where that's not possible, and we have to then risk assess whether we need to speak to that person on that day. If they're homeless on that day, they will be seen, they will be offered an opportunity to be spoken with and try to find a solution. We'll be establishing what needs an individual has, what support needs they have, potentially also what care needs they may have. Okay, so we'll be linking into colleagues across a range of sections and delivering what we call a personal housing plan. And that personal housing plan sets aside a range of actions and activities that, as a local authority, officers will be seeking to undertake in terms of referrals to other agencies, in terms of what assistance will be provided, what the officer will do to maybe negotiate with maybe a mortgage lender, maybe a landlord in terms of sustaining accommodation, and also what steps we're expecting the individual to take. So it's a two-way process. And that's what we have to look here. This is how, in my mind, this is a conversation that's been happening with individuals, certainly in my time over the last sort of 13, 14 years. As soon as they walk through the door, it's that two-way conversation. And that's what we've got. That's what we need to have. And that's what we need to be sort of working towards. Again, completing those support referrals where needed, there are the messy bits around the statutory duties, as I call it. The statutory duties and the framework of the legislation makes it an extremely difficult process because there are letters flying around at the different stages, and there is work ongoing with Welsh Government and colleagues from Shelter Cymru and other local authorities around how we try and simplify some of that process, because individuals could be almost lost in the weight of the letters and correspondence that we send, but we're obliged to do because the law says we have to. Okay? So that's a whistle-stop tour of what we do linked to the legislation. Now, the specific points around the presentation picked up here. So homeless demand. Last financial year, around about 900 enquiries from individuals who were either at risk of homelessness or actually homeless. It's been fairly consistent in recent years. It hasn't increased significantly, but what I would say is that there is a complexity of individuals' needs that's increasing. The needs that we're seeing and the issues that people are presenting with are very different to what they were 3-4 years ago, and significantly very different to what I saw 20 years ago when I started out working in homelessness. Exceptionally different. Out of those individuals, around about 410 households were actually homeless, and 200 were then placed in temporary accommodation. Predominantly, and in the main, I have to say, all within the local authority area, albeit where we've had no alternative, we've had to look outside the borough. Of the remaining 200 households, they weren't eligible for that Section 68 duty to provide accommodation. So they're the ones that are really at risk, potentially, of rough sleeping. If people have heard, if members have heard the phrase sofa surfing, yeah, commonly used, that is a real risk, and that's how we try and work with those individuals at that Section 73 duty, that duty to seek to secure accommodation, to find solutions. So it just doesn't end. And even when that duty at Section 73 ends, local authorities are still obliged to still seek to help individuals to find solutions. And again, that's where partners come in. That's where the number of different tools that we've got in our kit bag, if you like, very crudely, help to actually try and alleviate that issue. But we have limited resources. We all know about the welfare reform pressures that have been there across the UK. We've got limited availability of accommodation. It's referenced in the report in terms of the availability coming through social housing. Social housing is not the sole solution here. We've got to find other solutions. And for me, it is about that blend of options that we need to have to actually tackle this wider issue and potentially have those solutions before individuals hit that crisis point. So it's that early intervention. And if people have heard the phrase upstreaming of support and upstreaming of work, that's where we need to be heading towards, is that getting in early, that early intervention, potentially even as early as getting into schools to educate individuals about what housing options are, what the realistic aspirations would be to actually prevent individuals from reaching that crisis point in the first place. So it's how we get in early to stop that happening. Okay. Rough sleeping. We know there's an increased demand. We know there's an increased demand in Torfaen. I've witnessed the startling increase that was there in Newport when I managed services and the pressure that abounds. We've seen the pressures that are there in Cardiff. This is not a Welsh phenomenon. If you go to other areas of the UK, you will see the same issues and pressures. It comes back to a range of issues that are there. Predominantly the changes around welfare reform, introduction and rollout of universal credit, the impact that's had on individuals in terms of the sanctions that people have had, the loss of accommodation, how in a way some of the complexities that individuals then have in terms of their needs creates a barrier in terms of how they're then accessing the vital provisions that are there in terms of the payments to actually sustain accommodation and actually sustain their lives and their living circumstances. And that's where we're seeing that spiral. There are clear difficulties in engagement. Engaging with individuals is extremely difficult when they've got those complex needs, when they become potentially entrenched into a rough sleeping lifestyle, or they can't see an exit to the issues that they're faced with. This is where I think the point I'd make at the very outset in terms of the staff's approach that I've seen since I've been here and the approach of providers is that relationship. That relationship is critical in maintaining that contact and maintaining that change. Without that, you are not going to actually elicit a change in somebody's life. You're not going to get them from street to accommodation. And we need to think about things slightly differently, which is where I'll come in a second around Housing First and how that changes some of the traditional approaches to addressing homelessness. What I would say is sustaining those changes is equally complex, equally difficult. We can provide a home to somebody, but if they're struggling with that home, how do we ensure that they're sustaining that accommodation? How do we make sure that they stay connected to services? How do we make sure that once that support has ended or petered off, how do we make sure that they're comfortable in coming back to an agency, doesn't really matter who, to ask for that help, so that they don't go back to that spiral of sort of just slipping the letters underneath the mat, not responding to correspondence that's there around a sanction on benefits, not responding to a change in terms of their housing benefit income through universal credit. That's the critical thing then. Can find the accommodation, how do we then sustain it? The one thing I would say is we've got to take those opportunities when they're available. Many years ago, and I digress a little bit, but I had a tenancy support manager I worked with, and he was walking through a city centre in Newport. There's a guy outside who was rough sleeping. The cafe owner had bought him a coffee. He sat down next to him, started a conversation, just an innocent conversation, just to ask him, what he needed, what he wanted. He got a dog with him. He touched his dog, and it was the first word he'd spoken to him since he'd sat down. And the words were, "Don't touch my dog. You can touch me, but not my dog." He started a conversation. He bought him a bite to eat, started a bit of a rapport with him. He got him into the office. Long story cut very short is over that period of time we built up that relationship with that tenancy support manager, and that gentleman moved from the street to a tenancy, and he's still there now 6 years on. And he'd been an entrenched rough sleeper going from accommodation to accommodation, spiralling from accommodation to homelessness for years and years and years. And he'd be very difficult to engage with. So that one chance opportunity that was taken and that inadvertent move to touch the dog, which was seen as his and his alone, made that difference. And that's always stuck with me in terms of going forward, in terms of how we've changed an individual's life. That one opportunity. So, meeting the need. We have a regional homelessness strategy set up across the 5 Gwent areas. Torfaen are heavily embedded within that, and there's a local and regional action plan that sits alongside that strategy. It's extremely robust in terms of the actions that are there, and the actions are ongoing. They're focused around looking at those opportunities across the region to deliver better outcomes for individuals and link to a range of different services. We can't solve the issues alone in Torfaen. Neither can they be solved in Caerphilly, Blaenau Gwent, Monmouthshire or Newport. There has to be some collective response to some of the issues that we're seeing in terms of the pressures we have, purely as well on the basis of the funding. There's not enough funding there to tackle all these issues. We have a rough sleeper group that meets to address the issues of the rough sleepers within the county. We have an adverse weather plan. We have Cornerstone, who are here today, who are delivering that outreach support in terms of delivering those real outcomes to those individuals who are out there and trying to get them away from the street into accommodation and connected to key support services. And we've a night shelter pilot project that is also what I would very, very crudely refer to as a pop-up night shelter that's available this year now in terms of addressing the need should the weather turn inclement. We've got 2 other things that are ongoing. First one is a young person supported accommodation scheme, which is with Pobble. It's running across 4 areas in Gwent. And essentially this provides accommodation to individuals under the age of 35 in shared environments. So 2-bed flats with a lot of support attached, and the potential then for that to be a sort of semi-permanent home whilst individuals get back on their feet and access things like education, employment, training opportunities and other options. We haven't got any properties as yet set up in Torfaen, but we're working towards that, and the scheme has been held up through the funding not coming through very quickly. It only came through late last year in around about October time. The first property's gone live, I think, in Newport with this, and one of the first people who went in there was one of Newport's rough sleepers who were under 35. So the impact is potentially there for us to be assisting individuals. We then have Housing First. What I'll do before I go into the pilot that's there, which is in Newport, but I'll explain a bit about that and how we're linked into that in a second. Housing First, very, very crudely, is a change in approach in terms of how we deal with individuals who are seeking accommodation, who are at their lowest ebb, who are rough sleeping predominantly. We're also extremely difficult and chaotic and have a history potentially of losing accommodation. Traditionally, individuals come into services and go in potentially to temporary accommodation, maybe some move-on accommodation, so a bit like a staircase, and then into permanent accommodation. So it's a very, very much a staircasing approach. So you prove yourself across these different stages. What Housing First does is demolish the staircase and effectively make a bungalow. Because what Housing First predominantly is about engaging with an individual who potentially has a number of issues, maybe mental health issues, maybe substance misuse issues, maybe offending issues, certainly a history of tenancy failure and disengagement with services, to provide them with a service around them in their own home, in an area they want to live, and to access the support when and where they want it. It's a very crude description of Housing First, but it's probably the most effective one, because it is one that actually changes that staircasing approach where individuals have to access and sustain services and comply with different support plans. This is about the individual dictating their support plans and their support needs. It actually provides a different approach and model that has reaped huge benefits, as referenced in the report, certainly in the US, but also in other areas, certainly within Europe. Now, the pilot is in Newport. Originally, the bid that was put in by Pobble was across the Gwent area, and there were some discussions around Welsh Government's approach here, in that they're predominantly concerned about the growing levels of rough sleeping within the main urban areas, so the city areas of Cardiff, Swansea, Newport, and then Wrexham. So there was a very targeted approach with Housing First in those particular localities. Discussions were had then with Welsh Government. I was party to those in my previous role around my concern that we were forgetting about the pressures that would be in those other areas where there was a noted increase of rough sleeping, as we've seen here, as we've seen in Caerphilly, as we've seen in Monmouth and also Blaen y Gwent. So the undertaking was very much that if there were individuals who would qualify and require the Housing First project from other areas, that could be accessed. If accommodation could be sourced, then the support could be provided from Pobble within that Housing First model. So whilst the pilot is predominantly in Newport and delivers 25 units, or potential for 25 units of this Housing First accommodation, we have the ability to refer people in should we see that they're going to qualify for that, and subject to Pobble then agreeing that is the way they want to go. But we have the undertaking from Welsh Government that we can access that. So we have technically Housing First within the Torfaen area. Okay. So in summary, and then I'll hand over to Councillor Daniels, is homelessness is extremely complex. I've worked in homelessness now for well over 20 years. the complexity of needs that we're seeing today in terms of officers, see people on the front line with what issues they're coming forward with, is significantly more complex than it has ever been. We used to, probably 20 years ago, maybe see one or two individuals who got a complexity of need a week. We're probably seeing one or two a day at present, and that's the startling difference. It's more than just housing. This is not, the solution is not just to put a roof over individuals' heads. This is about bringing those other services in and wrapping those services around those individuals who need it, and having a coordinated response. So this comes back to probation, health, social care, all the connections that are there in terms of addressing those needs that individuals have. And listening, more importantly, listening to what individuals want, which in past years we've probably not been good at, but we're getting better. As agencies, we're getting better as local authorities at listening to that. So that multi-agency approach is critical. Going back to Housing First and the flattening of the staircase, and the staircase that's there in terms of traditional, some people still need the staircase. Some people will succeed with Housing First. Some people will need other solutions, and there'll be other ideas that we potentially have. But it's important to remember that one size doesn't fit all, and that individuals have a choice. Those various approaches we need to be mindful of. We need to be able to give staff on the ground in terms of local authority staff, and also agencies who are working with the local authority, the various tools within the kit bag and the various approaches to find those solutions. So to think outside the box. Most importantly is how we get in there early, because early intervention is significantly cheaper than the longer term intervention. Significantly cheaper. To cost that out when you look at things in terms of the provision of other services where individuals may end up going in hospital because they've been rough sleeping, or individuals have had stays in custody because of X, Y and Z that's happened, that is a significant cost to the public purse. If we can turn that around, then there's a wider cost saving as a whole, and we need to be mindful of that. But again, I have to stress that is not just about housing. It's not just about the local authority. It's a partnership approach. We need to be focused on the outcomes, not so rigid in terms of the data recording, but what are those softer outcomes? What are the differences we've made to individuals' lives? Going back to the story I told about the guy in Newport, what's the difference to his life there? I'm sure if I went along and saw him now, he would be in a much better place and be really explaining the difference that that's made to his life going forward. Critically, a lot of the things we're talking about here require funding. They do require a leap of faith, particularly maybe from other organisations, to be looking at co-funded projects that deliver critical outcomes. To looking at how we change our whole approach from front to back in terms of how we intervene in earlier. If we can get into situations at an early point where we've seen something that's critically going wrong, fundamentally going wrong, perhaps in somebody's tenancy with one of our housing association partners, how do we then link in to solve that situation, to sustain that accommodation? More importantly, sustain that person in the community that have probably been in for the last 20 years, because the community is where they need to be. We have to temper all this, I feel, against expectations that need to be managed. Because people's expectations can be very high against what can be realistically achieved because of the resources that we have available. We have a shortage of housing in the borough. We've got over 2,500 people on the waiting list. We are unable to meet that whole need. We've got a demand for accommodation that is far outstripping the supply, so we have to find alternatives. But equally, we need to manage individuals' expectations. We need to have conversations, I think, with people around shared accommodation options, because that is how we're then making potentially best use of accommodation and giving people opportunities moving forward. And just very quickly before I hand over, again, I can't stress enough the complexity of needs that we see, and the integration of services in terms of delivering those outputs on the ground, in terms of involving statutory services across adult and children's services, linking in with probation, police and other partners across the RSL sector, across support sector. That is fundamentally critical in keeping that going forward. And from what I've seen, there's a real desire to make that work in Torfaen. That's all I've got to go through in terms of the report. I know there'll be time for questions at the end. Right, Councillor Daniels has a number of things that he wishes to just raise at the end to summarise.
Thank you, Simon, and welcome back. I mean, I wasn't here in 2006. I think I was probably still at school. But it's good to have you back, and I think your experience that you've built up over those years is bearing fruit already. So just felt the need to say that. And obviously I'd like to thank the whole of the housing team and our partners Cornerstone for working together to put this report together today. It's a very comprehensive report which details the picture here in Torfaen, including the challenges and the interventions, of which there are many. I'd like to think, whatever our political differences, that we come here today with one aim, and that's to see how we can improve things for rough sleepers in the borough, and indeed actually end rough sleeping in Torfaen. So Simon's already made reference to the fact that the answers aren't simple, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't keep asking the questions. And I'm genuinely grateful for this meeting being called today, because it does give us an opportunity to meet together as a council and look at this issue together, rather than in any silos of any type. Homelessness and rough sleeping can be a deeply frustrating issue, but I think we've got lots of good practice that we can shout about. And lots of promising news, actually, which will come out of today. And I think collectively we can say as a council, not just the Labour group, I think as a council we can say that we're trying our very best under some challenging circumstances. So the report outlines some of the challenges that we face, and Simon's already gone through a few of them, but I think they're always worth bearing out when considering the issue in full, because they provide a context for what we're battling against. So the Housing Solutions Service, as mentioned, has dealt with 900 households who were experiencing difficulty with housing last year. 435 households were at immediate risk of homelessness, 410 who were actually homeless. And of course, we've at any given time, we've got 2,500 people on the waiting list, which can't be separated from this wider argument. It is a driving factor of why we're not able to help people as timely and as effectively as we need to be able to. So it can't be seen without acknowledging that fact. And in fact, last year we had 858 properties advertised on Home Seeker, and 85 households bidding for each property on average. So if that doesn't highlight the scale of the problem that we've got, I don't know what will. And of course, over the course of the past nearly 3 years actually, we've been the test bed for universal credit, which can't be understated, because vulnerable people were exposed to the early stages of universal credit when waiting times were months rather than weeks. I mean, they're still not there, but it's left people who are still probably paying the price now with arrears from that period. So it can't be seen, this whole picture can't be seen without that being considered. So all of these make for a very difficult overall picture, and they mean the work that our housing teams face can often be a thankless task. However, in spite of this, I firmly believe that the team have stepped up to the plate. So Simon has touched upon the measures that we're talking about, the measures that we've taken, but I'd like to go into, bear with me, I'm one of the many people who've got a cold and a giant bottle. So they're here today. We've got Cornerstone. We've commissioned Cornerstone to provide a rough sleeper outreach programme, and I've shadowed you on a number of occasions, and I will continue to do so, because it's a very valuable experience, and I recommend any member in this room to catch them whilst they're here today to talk about the work that they're doing, because They are very much on the front line of things and working with what can often be some very, very complex, difficult people who aren't quite ready to accept help just yet, but they are there to work them towards accepting help and to being in a place where they will be able to sustain the help that we're giving them. They've been invaluable, so I do recommend members speak to them after this meeting. As already mentioned, we've set up a Rough Sleeper support group, which is a multi-agency group featuring Gwent Police, our community safety team represented at the back, our homeless team, and of course Cornerstone. I've attended that since its conception, and it's been fantastic at sharing information and taking a coordinated approach to both supporting and intervening, unfortunately, where necessary, for rough sleepers in the borough, and that meets regularly. We've also got an adverse weather policy, as mentioned, a more robust adverse weather policy than the Welsh Government guidance. So just last year, on the request of the leader, we looked into it again, and we improved the offer so that rough sleepers are brought indoors under adverse weather conditions, so 0 degrees. They're brought indoors immediately and for longer. We're also working on opening our first night shelter in the borough to provide additional local accommodation for rough sleepers over the coming months. It'll be based in a local church hall, so participation by the community, and who are frequently stepping up to the plate, particularly churches, because there's an awful lot of involvement in food banks, so clearly showing that this isn't just an issue for us. And it'll be run by Cornerstone and funded by the Welsh Government's Housing Support Grant. As also mentioned, we'll be able to refer into the Housing First pilot in Newport very soon. They're not at full capacity yet, but as and when they are, we will be able to refer into that programme. And indeed, we intend to, because I had a presentation with the Minister, Julie James, prior to Christmas about Housing First and the pilots that are going on up and down the country, and I am very much bought into the fact that it is a good programme and the principles are sound. So at any point that pilot is expanded, we did hope to participate as part of the multi-agency, multi-regional bid, but unfortunately that's been singled out as Newport. However, any expansion of the programme, any growth, we will put our hands up first and say we will be part of that. So I'm also pleased, very pleased actually, to say that we will be ceasing use of B&Bs, which is quite something. Shelter and Crisis have long advocated for the ceasing of use of B&Bs, and it's indeed been something we've aspired to for quite some time. We're in the process of securing locally based housing to take the place of B&Bs, which unfortunately have all been located out of county because of lack of capacity in Torvine. So one in Abertillery and one in Newport. And I've been to the Abertillery one through volunteering with Track 2. And I can say I'm very, very pleased that this is coming to fruition. And it will have an additional benefit for rough sleepers currently in the public at the moment, in that it will take our emergency accommodation from 2 places, which the B&B currently provides, to 8. So that will enable us to more timely refer in rough sleepers to accommodation. So I'm very pleased with that. And of course, as that progresses, I'll keep members informed and updated, because I think it's some positive news, and hopefully you'll all share enthusiasm in it. And I'm also pleased, mentioned by Simon, that the Welsh Government have provided funding to Pobl to deliver a young person's accommodation scheme in 4 areas, which include Torvine, meaning that shared accommodation will be provided for young people in need, and will be part of a wider funding programme to help tackle youth homelessness. And that follows the principles of, again, it follows the principles of Housing First. And youth homelessness is something which, quite frankly, is unacceptable. And I'm very pleased that Welsh Government are putting their money where their mouth is where that's concerned. And finally, a key part of the solution in this crisis is going to be the delivery of quality and genuinely affordable rented accommodation. Indications from Welsh Government suggest that this will be a priority issue for the foreseeable future, and the Minister, Julie James, has laid out her ambition for councils to build quality housing at an increased rate. I've already met with 3 of the main registered social landlords. Bron Avon are represented here today, and I'm very, very pleased that they are. Melin and Pobble to discuss their ambition around house building, and I'm very pleased to report to members that they've been very receptive toward the ambition that the Minister has shown and the ambition that we have. I'll be meeting with all 3 on a regular basis to keep track of the developments that they have in the pipework and any potential roadblocks in the way, and I'll be doing my absolute best to encourage ambitious affordable house building in Torfaen. That went on a bit longer than I'm usually comfortable with, but I hope members can appreciate there's a good deal of promising news where homelessness and rough sleeping is concerned. All of it is achieved with supportive and constructive counsel, which we are, and I hope today proves to be a successful and useful session for everybody. So thank you for listening.
Thank you, David. Right, if I open it up then to questions and comments, if people start. No turn. Right, okay. Before we start, I'm just going to sort of use my prerogative. My question is always around what we do to engage private landlords all through the process, not just at the stage where somebody's become a rough sleeper. Because obviously, with the best will in the world, we'll never house everybody through the RSLs. So, just around things like removing those barriers. I mean, obviously, I can understand from a private landlord's point of view, but in terms of not having pets, for example, not being in receipt of certain benefits, etc., etc.
Okay, we've got a prevention fund that we use to seek to prevent homelessness. Now, that can be used for a range of things, one of which is around breaking down the financial barriers that people face in terms of securing private rented accommodation, so things such as bonds and rent in advance. Fees are now a thing of the past because they have effectively been banned, although I'm sure that there will be other costs that are then borne on top of the rent as a result of that. The issue around accessing private rented accommodation is a really, really difficult one, because the rent levels are something that causes significant issues, because the local housing allowance rate for the area is below what the majority of the properties are let at. So that gives us a difficulty in terms of sourcing accommodation. We potentially have to look at how we cover that shortfall and that gap in that rent for a short period of time. We do have some positive links with private landlords. Councillor Daniels has just alluded to the 2 landlords we were working with on the accommodation initiatives there. That is new. That is something that's innovative in terms of taking things forward. But there is a further role in terms of what we do as a local authority, locally, and also what we do regionally to try and invigorate that sector, and how we provide landlords not just with the finances, but with the support to wrap around them as much as the tenants to actually sustain that accommodation and give them the confidence that we're actually invested in the sector alongside them. Without that, we're going to have great difficulty going forward. So we do what we can. There's some remodelling that Welsh Government are doing around the provision of bond schemes at present, and there's an ongoing review with Welsh Government around the bond scheme that's here in Torfaen that's delivered by Pobble. But that's delivered over a number of other areas as well. There's a piece of work that is being done over the next sort of 3 to 6 months that will see potentially a change in terms of how the traditional old bond schemes operated and work. So that will be something going forward. It is a very difficult area because, let's face it, private landlords are business people. They want a return on their investment, and if they can get the investment at a higher level from individuals who've got the cash, who are working, they will take that above individuals who are going to be on benefits. It's added complexity around universal credit and the issues that are there, albeit we can provide some reassurance around that. The sector in Torfaen is not as robust as other areas, but we're working with landlords as best we can to find those solutions.
Thank you. It's great to hear about the support that's available for landlords. Okay, I've got Sue first and then Hugh.
Thank you, Simon, Dave and Cornerstone. I'm so pleased with the partnership work that you've got with Cornerstone. There's members here now might not be aware of the great varied work that they do within Torfaen. I'm aware of the work that they do. They work ground level with people with complex needs, vulnerability, addictions, alcohol abuse, and I'm pleased to say that Cornerstone has secured a building within Torvine, and within the period of the 12 months that I've worked with them, they have housed and still supporting 6 individuals. And now these 6 individuals were very, very hardcore, complex needs, vulnerable and addictions. They work with them on a daily basis. They gained their trust. Now they're all in their own properties. They're supported by Cornerstone, other various agencies, and they're keeping that tenancy. So if this support weren't there, if Cornerstone weren't there, these 6 individuals wouldn't be in their properties. So I thank you from myself for the great work that you do.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. First off, I'd like to commend on the initiatives and what's going on in the report. It seems that there's an awful lot of good work going on, especially in terms of stopping homelessness from occurring in the first place, in terms of that early intervention stage. I've got a number of questions, though, please, if I may, from the report. On page 10, it says that the Pobble Group secured funding from Welsh Government to deliver the Housing First project, and the initial proposal from Welsh Government was to deliver a project across Gwent, but the funding available was scaled back to focus on Newport. So the first question is with regards to, have we made representations to the Welsh Government to see whether that funding can be extended to include the Torvine area as well? The report does go on to say we've got the ability to refer potential clients, although it's then added the caveat that accommodation will need to be sourced within the borough from partner RSLs. I know the question regarding that is, given that the report outlines that there's a shortage of accommodation within the borough, and we've had on average of 85 applications per one through our own housing referral scheme, what influence do we have in terms of working with the RSLs to ensure that we can get new accommodation, new builds, and to increase the stock of the I noticed that the report notes that there's an ongoing review of the current temporary accommodation portfolio, but it seems apparent that we don't have sufficient stock currently. So what is being done to address the stock levels? And will bear with me, please, there's 2 other things jump out at me. On page 9 of the report, under the night shelter, it says discussions are advancing well. Let's hope the shelter may be operational with the winter period of 2019-2020. Given that we're already just entered into January now 2020, please could you provide an update on the night shelter as to whether that's actually operational now and up and running? And sorry, finally, if you look at on page 6, in terms of the Welsh Government National Rough Sleep Account, it's basically saying we didn't have any in 2016-17, none in 17-18, and only 2 in 2018 and 19. If we were just going on that information alone, it would suggest that we haven't really got a big problem with rough sleeping within the borough. However, this is only a count that's undertaken on one day of the year, I'm aware of that. And there's been a report on the Welsh News recently, I don't know if members saw it, about a young homeless person who'd gone into primary school to talk about his experiences to the children. And he was one of these sofa surfers that you alluded to earlier. And that report on the Welsh News suggested that there might be as many as 3,500 sofa surfers within Wales. Now, how do we account for those young people that are not sleeping on the streets but are effectively homeless because they're having to move from one sofa to another, one group of friends to another? How do they present themselves, and what support is available for those sofa surfers, please? Thank you very much.
Okay, I will try to answer those questions as thoroughly as I can. Going back to that final question first, if I may, around sofa surfing. It's a very difficult area to get to grips with because we just don't know the volume. So there will be a number of individuals who have never accessed services, who've never approached services, who are just sleeping on somebody's sofa. They've not approached any of the third sector agencies, partner agencies. They just remain hidden. In effect, they're the hidden homeless is another term that's often used. What we do, and I alluded to it in a way in the presentation, if we become aware of individuals like that, we offer them the advice, assistance and options that anybody would be entitled to because they don't have any security of accommodation. They don't have a room of their own. In effect, they are homeless, by definition. So we would be offering them the same service if they came forward. So if you are aware of individuals in that way, we will work with them to try and find those solutions. Okay. In terms of the count, I have to say I am not a fan of the annual counts that are there. They don't give a true picture of what is happening. But Welsh Government reinitiated the count, I think in around about 2014-15 onwards. It may have been the year after that, I forget now. After not doing it for a number of years because of the rise in rough sleeping. A lot of local authorities don't have any outreach services. So they don't have the intelligence on the ground that actually indicates what the true picture is. We've got the intelligence now in terms of the work that Cornerstone are doing, and we know what the numbers are. We know that there are around about 6 individuals at the moment, I think, that's out there that are effectively we've identified and be working with, and that number's changed from what it was potentially maybe 3 months ago, 4 months ago, 5 months ago. And the individuals have changed as well because of the work that's been done. So I'm not a fan of the counts, but they do give a barometer reading to what's happening. So they have a little bit of validity, but you have to take that in the context of what else is going on. What is more important that sits behind that, when the counts are done, local authorities collect records from agencies who've been approached by individuals who've been sleeping rough over a 2-week period. So it's what's referred to as a snapshot survey, and that gives much more robust information around what's happening. And the Housing Network project that I alluded to in the presentation and the Homeless Network produce a report that's given to local authorities. Local authority data's in there, national data's in there, around the number of individuals who've been identified over that 2-week period, which tells a very different picture to the numbers that's identified on that count, because that's there. Going back to Housing First and the funding with Welsh Government, the funding bid was initially put in as a Gwent bid. There were a lot of projects submitted to Welsh Government, and the funding that was set aside on what they referred to as the Trailblazer programme was oversubscribed, and they wanted, and I think this is right, to have a variety of approaches across a variety of areas, and they had to scale back the programme because the funding that they had didn't meet the demand that they saw from local authorities and partners to deliver that. So the discussions that we'd had with Welsh Government at the time, this was going back 6-7 months ago, was a concern that I'd raised with Welsh Government and spoke to officials around, alongside Pobl, was, well, we still feel there is a need in other areas to deliver Housing First, because the impact would then just be on that one area, and individuals gravitate towards where the services are. And that, in my mind, is inherently wrong. We need to look after individuals within our own communities, make those connections, and hence the discussions with Welsh Government were very much around that, if you like, piggybacking on the back of that project that would be centred in Newport because it's a high demand area, but then would have the ability to link into other options that are there. So we can actually go into that with our partners. If we identify an individual, we have very positive discussions with Bronavon, Melin, Pobl and the other RSLs that operate in the area around access and accommodation for a range of individuals, and that's done now. That's done now from dealing with complex cases that we see that are coming through, maybe through the criminal justice system or through discharge from hospital. There's a very, very good dialogue that goes on through that Home Seeker partnership. So that's a real positive relationship that we have. But forgive me, the final question was...
The night shelter.
The night shelter, yes. The night shelter is up and running. It is a pop-up night shelter, so when the temperature drops, we can initiate the shelter and get people off the streets, or have the offer to get people off the streets. We cannot force people to go into accommodation. It is back to choice. If somebody wants to sleep rough, if somebody chooses not to take up that offer of accommodation, we cannot force them to take that offer. And that is something that I come back to. It is around individual choice at times. I don't subscribe to the theory that is purported from some quarters that rough sleeping is a lifestyle choice. I don't believe that. I believe people have ended up in that way because of different things that have happened. It's how we work with people to change that mindset. And that, for me, is a critical thing. How do we get under the skin of that? Thank you.
Okay, I got Rose next, then Rob.
Thank you, Chair. My point is, I've raised it in the domestic violence strategy before now, but what partnership do you have with the DWP? Obviously, universal credit is a major issue in all this, one of the major issues in all this. I just wanted to know how involved in the partnership working is the DWP. We're all aware of the changes in the benefit, and we're not sure how aware people are of what they have, the hoops they have to jump through on universal credit, such as answering emails and going down to an appointment. Well, if they haven't got a home and they haven't got a phone, and they haven't got any point of charging that telephone if they have a phone, you know, it's one vicious circle. So my point with the domestic violence is there didn't seem to be a link. There seemed to be a link with all the other organisations and the Welsh Government, but there is a disconnect between Welsh Government, local government and the DWP because it's up in Westminster. I'd like your views on that, please, Stephen.
I think I might be best placed to answer that. So the DWP is one of a partner agency in the Welfare Reform Project Group, which specifically looks at things like universal credit and other welfare changes that are on the horizon. It doesn't necessarily solely look at rough sleeping and homelessness as a consequence. However, that is inevitably brought up. I think there probably is scope for them to be greater involved in our strategic housing forum or something like that when we have a particular subject that comes up, such as rough sleeping or homelessness. But being quite honest and quite blunt about things, the DWP locally do work with TCBC and other partners, particularly Track 2, Singer Sue sat next to me on a ground level. And locally, I'd say they get it. The trouble is that they can only do so much when the decisions are taken in Westminster, and they might agree and they might get the consequences that the inadvertent consequences, if I'm going to be generous, but they can't change them locally. So we ask them to feedback regularly at the Welfare Reform Project Group, but in terms of enacting those changes, it is very much down to Westminster. But I take the point around including them in forums which perhaps they might not otherwise be expected to attend. So strategic housing forum comes to mind.
So, thank you, Chair. Can I apologise first of all, if you like, because my thoughts are all over the place here, and I've been trying to basically get them into some form of order. Could I first of all declare an interest? I am a private sector landlord, and basically I would like to respond to you, as in your questioning regarding the private sector landlord and my experience as well. But in amongst my statement or my thoughts, if you like, there will be some questions which are going to be coming up as well. Basically, I've worked with the rough sleepers for many years as well, and could I first of all say that not all private sector landlords are in it for the money. If you like, some people do have a heart as such, and in regarding the properties of my properties, I purposely basically gave over specifically for rough sleepers within Torvine. But alongside that, as a private sector landlord, there came an expense. Now, when it came to the expense, it's basically the properties that basically I purchased, if you like, some of the lenders wouldn't lend money on it because of the clientele to begin with. If like the insurance was higher because of the clientele as well. We have rules and regulations to basically conform with as well, because we've got to be accredited landlords as well, which there's a cost. We've got, if you like, other costs when it comes to the safety of the building as well. And so roughly to get a property up and running to the standard which is required to basically house an individual person, you're looking at many thousands of pounds. If basically I've put in a family, let's put it that way, if like my expense would be minimal, if like at the end of the day. But because we've got these people or these individuals with special needs or so-called special needs, if you like, there's additional expense. When it came to the referrals, if you like, I depended on referrals coming from supported agencies, which basically were under the umbrella of Torvine, and not being funny, they were a nightmare, if you like, and I relied on referrals coming, the right referrals coming to us, and because we had multiple needed individuals coming together who weren't compatible, let's put it that way. Now, in regarding the support, yes, the support was there because a lot of these agencies have crisis teams, and so they work specifically for a set period of time just to get them off the street. Then, as soon as there's a roof over their head, the support stops. Well, when it comes to the crisis team, when I say stops, it's not stopped within the agency because it's then transferred to another department within the agency to secure long-term accommodation. That can take 16 weeks. So for that period of time between the person moving into the if like the property and getting ongoing support, 16 weeks. I've had long conversations with a manager, if like, of one of these schemes in regarding the needs of the individual. And at the end of the day, it doesn't fit their crisis, or not their crisis, their criteria. And because it doesn't fit their criteria, they won't basically engage with them. Now, in regarding these houses, or these two particular houses, because of my working background, a lot of my time was spent in basically trying to get these individuals stables because they wouldn't, if like there wasn't the support out there for them. Unfortunately, due to antisocial behaviour within the community, and the community I worked extremely hard with, if you like, to get them on board, and they worked with me, but up to a point. But the point came where basically in one particular area there was World War III that broke out. I'm going to say that, but there weren't any nuclears, etc. However, if you like, it came to the stage where the police there was police interaction, and one of my questions in regarding the two properties which basically we have out of county, I'd like to know what sort of agreement they have within these properties, because I basically offered, if you like, a tenancy agreement individually. To get these individuals out, basically, I had to go through the judiciary service, which I had to do. It cost me, but individually. And so it cost me a lot of money to evict them correctly, and I do use the word evict them, if you like, because if I didn't, the police would shut down the building, and it's that simple. Bringing it more in line now.
Sorry, Rob, I'm just being told that we've got to be careful. We can't identify anyone, so just.
That's fine. My concern to bring it back in line again, and this was my genuine concern. When they came into me, they were banded in gold. Happy days, great, right? But basically, as soon as they moved into the property, they moved down to bronze. And because they were on bronze, they didn't have any support, if you like. They could move. And now these properties, I wanted to use as stepping stones for them to move out to their own independent accommodation, to bring another person in, if you like, etc., etc. That's the way I perceived it working. It didn't, if you like, at the end of the day. And so that's a problem. The fact that basically we are taking people off the streets and then debanding them, if you like, at the end of the day, which is wrong. If you like, from a Torvine stance, if like, unfortunately Torvines has lost, if you like, eight beds, if you like, over the last year. In regarding universal credit, as well, to be fair to Torvine, financially there wasn't any issue. There wasn't any issue. They basically were very supportive in basically making sure that all the benefits were in place, etc., etc. When it comes to the universal credit and the escalation, if you like, in regarding, or seems to be the escalation in regarding people who are now being made homeless because of universal credit, what I'm going to ask is basically where is the support, if you like, for these people who have been made redundant, homeless because of universal credit? Where is the support beforehand, if you like? Is it because they're not coming for help, or is it because the staff are overworked that there's a waiting list? If you like, because there's a reason why they are being made homeless, and it could be universal credit, it could be complex, no end system of no end of reasons. Thank you. If you like, at the end of the day, and so basically, homelessness, I'm sorry to say, isn't going to go away. It is not going to go away. It's been there for decades. It will continue to be there for decades because we cannot support everyone, because some people do not want help. I appreciate that. I've accepted that, etc., etc. And so homelessness is not going to go away. In regarding, and I'm going to say two more things. An application has just come into my ward, and it's for a HMO. and basically it is going to be purchased and managed by an agency. However, the clients who are likely to be homeless are coming from another area. Okay? And so basically, if the fact that we've got properties, if like, outside the county, and yet, if like, the other authorities, which are basically they are employing agencies to purchase a house to basically bring in the people from another area. That I think possibly as well. I totally accept as well is that due to some complex needs and it could be domestic abuse, etc. Some of our own residents need to be accommodated outside the area as well. I accept that. Don't have a problem with that. But when you're looking at specifically taking over of a home to turn into a HMO to basically take people off the street, which is coming from another area, I'm not too aware. I have got concerns about, and I'm going to be quiet at that point because I've said enough at the moment.
Okay, if I answer some of the the latter points, then I'll ask Andrew to perhaps come in on a couple of the other issues. Around firstly, the private rented sector, I agree that there are some very, very good landlords out there. Indeed, we're working with two at the moment that have been alluded to by Councillor Daniels in his closing remarks there, in terms of providing accommodation to individuals with an agreement that we're brokering going forward. The point around other local authorities using accommodation in other areas, it isn't unlawful for an authority to do that. It's not unlawful. There's nothing to preclude that happening, but there are certain criteria that need to be met. Local authorities need to notify the receiving authority that they have placed an individual there, and under what duties, whether that is a duty to discharge the homeless responsibilities in its permanent sense or in its temporary sense, and it needs to be done within 14 days. What we try to do, we try to have that dialogue with our partner local authorities, and we do have that dialogue, that when individuals are placed in the borough, and we do this if we're placing, say, in Newport or in other areas, we will notify that authority prior to making the placement, because there's an issue there around risk management. We don't want to put an individual into accommodation where it's posing a risk to them, or potentially they could pose a risk to others, because that's when we get embroiled in nasty, awful incidents that do occur. So we have that agreement locally. Now, whether local authorities follow that is another matter. I'm unsure of the property that you're referring to, Councillor, in terms of your ward with a HMO status. I am aware that one of the properties that was potentially being used and put forward, and I'm aware was in the press in terms of the planning application, we're currently working with that landlord at the moment in terms of that property, and that's part of the work that we're then doing. And I wholly agree as well in terms of the support that's offered around individuals in accommodation, around the support that's then offered in the longer term, and the support to landlords. And I'd like to think that, going back to the answer I gave around the review of bond schemes across Wales, I would hope that that comes across from that review within Welsh Government in terms of the change in dynamic of those schemes, their delivery, how they need to be more supportive towards landlords in terms of managing tenancies and helping with that support role, not just for the tenant but for landlords as well. So I think there's a changing thing there. So the things that you've mentioned and alluded to, I think will be addressed through that review that Welsh Government are undertaking. I think in terms of the contractual arrangements, I think it may be useful if I ask Andrew to maybe comment on those from Cornerstone's perspective.
Hi Robert, I'm sorry to hear you've had such grief, but it's something I've heard of in the past as well. Myself, I'm the Chief Executive of Cornerstone. I set it up 5.5 years ago after working with Rough Sleepers for over 20 years. And I pick up on your points as valid because I can see the problems that were occurring in certain organisations with waiting lists, etc. The reason I believe the success we've had, which is over 90% of people we set up in a tenancy are still maintaining that tenancy 12 months later. And it's because of the model and the partnerships that we actually undertake. So what we will do is, like a HMO, and I'm more than happy to chat to you after, by the way, we will house people, hopefully match them together. The idea is they go into night shelter, we can see how well people get on, partner them up, go into private rental accommodation, and our staff member will have access to that property on a daily basis to work through any issues, to address any antisocial behaviour. And when somebody is ready, like you said about that step, to move on to more independent accommodation, I take your point that they go from gold to bronze because they're no longer street homeless. But we've got a system in place where we will bond somebody out of the property once they're ready, and then to move the next person in. So it's a cycle, and it's utilising properties like yours to actually make a difference to Rough Sleepers on an ongoing basis to get more people off the street. Okay.
If you want to come back in later, Rob, I just want to say thanks for coming back to me on the... I think it's good for us to see the difficulties, because it's very easy to say, oh, this is the answer, that's simple. But actually, it's such a complex issue on all fronts. Right, okay, next we've got Alan and then Janet.
Okay, thank you, Chair. I think my question may well have been answered, to be honest, and it really surrounds the count. I see last year the count was it 2 in Torfaen? We've got 4 at the moment, 4 Rough Sleepers, and we've had 3 for months on end. Now, I just want some kind of reassurance, really, that, you know, we are aware of all our Rough Sleepers, so we are fully appreciative of the scale of the problem.
Okay, if I take this initially and then perhaps ask Andrew to maybe come in. Cornerstone are out there on a regular basis and are engaging with individuals who are out and about sleeping rough, which we all agree shouldn't happen. It does happen, but it's how we're dealing with that. As I alluded to when I was doing the presentation, there's a lot of areas that don't have outreach services, and so they don't really know the scale of the problem, and the links then are left to maybe church groups and other voluntary groups that aren't necessarily always interlinked with other agencies on the ground and linking into systems. What we do have is that ability to have that information on hand, and I think Andrew will be able to confirm the exact numbers that we're currently working with on the ground at the moment. The annual count, I said I'm not a fan of. I think the other contextual information gives us much more robust data around what's happening on the ground. The other information we can then gather around individuals who are seeking to access services, maybe sporadically sleeping rough, one night and then back onto the mate's sofa for maybe 3 or 4 nights, back maybe onto the street or another mate's sofa. That kind of thing, you know, we've got more information and intelligence on. Still not the full picture, but it's still there. I think the one thing I would say is the work we've got is intrinsically linked through that Rough Sleeper group. So there's a range of agencies coming together. So we've got those connections that are there. I think we're doing all we can, but I think it'd be useful if Andrew maybe adds to that in terms of what is actually happening and the numbers that are there. Final point from me is the count that was done in November. We've confirmed the number. I think there were 3 individuals were found to sleep rough on that night, which is then against the numbers that we knew were out there in terms of the work that Cornerstone were doing. We just didn't find them on the night. Because obviously people move around. Yeah.
Hi. Just to agree with Simon, I'm not a fan of the count night either. I think it's a lot of work and effort, and if you bear in mind the setup of this borough, it can be difficult risk-wise for staff to be out 2 o'clock in the morning in certain locations. So, you know, we'll never ever find everyone. Simon's touched on sofa surfers. This is the cohort that is the unknown. Every sofa surfer with a guarantee will sleep rough at some time. So at the moment we've got 6 regular rough sleepers in Torfaen. Not all of them are out every night. However, we've probably got a group of about 14, 15 who do stay out occasionally. Now, what we're providing under our contract in partnership with the local authority is 60 hours per week outreach. That's just the outreach side of our work. And a lot of that is out of hours. So when all services close, because the reason we do that is because if there are other services open, a rough sleeper may not want to engage. We go there when it's raining, it's cold, it's 4 o'clock in the morning, if you like, when no one else is there to talk to somebody, and that's where we start building the relationship. With regard to going back to the night shelter, we encourage people in, and it's a really powerful tool. And I'm excited to say that Torfaen are going with this model this winter, and we're looking forward to getting people under a roof, safe, warm, well, and we will get to know them and start delivering the outcomes we've done elsewhere.
Okay, Janet.
Thanks, Jane. I'd like to thank you for your presentation. I do share some of the comments that Councillor Kemp's made, because as an estate agency manager, I faced quite a lot of the same issues that Councillor Kemp did, having to get police to properties, and the reluctance of private landlords to take on people because they're afraid of the excess financial impact. And there was a total lack of support at sometimes from agencies such as yourself. I would urge that to engage more with private landlords and also offer them greater support. And I'm really glad to see that there are going to be changes in the bond scheme, which I hope will be more beneficial to providing help for these people.
We've got Dave Thomas next, and then Gwyn.
Thank you, Chair. I'd just like to say, I'd like to thank everyone involved in this report. It's a very well-written report, and to be honest, it's really encouraging to read some of the things that hopefully will be coming to fruition. My main question is on page 7, which is 6.6 of the report. Just wait for everyone to get that. Keen. How is the existing support delivered to rough sleepers? For example, in practical terms, how are rough sleepers given support to overcome their financial situation, etc., to help them back into formal education, accommodation?
Yeah, to be honest with you, after 20 years of doing this, everyone is different. So the key to the success of delivery for rough sleepers is always on gaining that trust and actually having quite an impact in the early days. So all the staff on this project in Torfaen are vastly experienced, 2 of which were rough sleepers themselves less than a year ago. So it's that peer connection of knowing what those barriers are. So we're not a bunch of office dwellers walking around with a clipboard. We're people who are real and understand what they're going through. Picking through the benefits, and somebody earlier mentioned the DWP. There's some great partnership going on with the DWP in this county, believe me. We work across a number of counties. It's very strong in Torfaen. They will work with us, and it's about taking the support to wherever an individual calls home. So that could be in the woods, it could be up a mountain in a tent or a shop doorway. We remove that barrier and we will go to them. We'll encourage them into a service, hot meal, shower, engage with other agencies, but it can be a long, slow process. There's a certain rough sleeper in your area at the moment we've been working with for over a year, practically on a daily basis, and we can go months with this person grunting at us and ignoring us. It doesn't put us off. We've got to be there because we're their last resort, we know that. It comes with a pressure, but it's also coming with a reassuring mindset that we're not going away. And the local authority have given us that flexibility to allow extended hours of support to address those issues, but each one is so different.
Gwyn?
Thank you, Madam Chair. First point is 7.8. I can understand the resistance from residents, but I cannot understand the resistance from housing providers and developers. I think it's a sad indictment of today's society. The second point is the churches. 8.3, night shelter. As we all know around here, there's not a lot of churches left, but I think we should really go forward on this one. Really, try and get something going. I know up in Nodville we've been trying hard to do it. And the third point is I noticed that we are working with Hales House, Bronhaven, and is this say Pobler? Is that how you say it? Pobler? There's no mention of Melin. Any reason why? And,
that's more than likely just an omission really in writing the report, so it's probably not quite as comprehensive as it should be. We work with all the housing association partners. They all have a role to play. They're all engaged in the work that we're doing. They're all delivering different outcomes at different times, bearing in mind the resources that they all have. So Melin are heavily engaged and heavily featured with the work that we do on a daily basis. So apologies, that probably should have been referenced there. But there are equally other housing associations as well in the area, United Welsh, Link Cymru, Hafford. They all work with us in different ways to achieve the right outcomes for individuals in the area.
what I would like to say is, I agree with Councillor Kemp on renting out, because my daughter was renting the house up, and well, you said it all anyway, but all I would say is that there was £3,500 rent owed to her, but £500 worth of damage, and to fittings and everything else, and the amount of rubbish we had to chuck out from it. So I fully endorse what Councillor Kent said on that one.
I got Anthony, then Peter, then Louise.
Okay, thank you, Chair, and I'd just like to thank you for such a comprehensive report. It's been good to look at an issue in such great depth this morning, and I'd also like to thank Dave Daniels and the team from Cornerstone and everyone. I think we can be reassured that we've got people who really care about this issue and have a passion for going above and beyond. It's often, I think, an issue that's left a bit behind the scenes, because a lot of the work you do, I guess, is by necessity confidential. You don't want to go broadcasting that you've helped someone. Equally, you don't want to go broadcasting that you've tried to help someone, but they've maybe not engaged. So I guess it can be quite frustrating sometimes, but I would like to say thank you for that dedication. I think that's important, because this isn't just about statistics, it's about people at the end of the day, and that does sometimes make it messy and complex, but I think that compassionate approach is necessary. I'm really pleased about the night shelter. I know we've had this discussion now for the last sort of 18 months about not just sitting behind sort of statutory minimums, but going above and beyond to try and help people. So I really welcome that. A few questions just quickly before I finish. One is about a lot of the studies seem to show that that benefit reform has been a big driver of this issue. So if there was one issue that maybe could be resolved above us, what would your message be there? My second question is about one particular at-risk group, which is armed forces veterans, who often, by dint of sort of challenges that they faced, get made homeless. Obviously that's a group that we've tried through the Armed Forces Covenant to put as a rightful priority as people who have served our country. And so what can we do to make sure that they don't get faced with homelessness, and when they do, that we support them as well as we can. The third question, I guess, is about communications and how we communicate it to well-meaning residents in the borough who maybe see someone homeless, see that they're still there, but can't get the context behind the story. So maybe just get frustrated, and they'll often voice to us as councillors, why don't you do anything about it? Now, I bet we wish we could say, yes, we are, these are the things we've done, but it's not worked yet. How can we sort of reassure people without breaking individuals' confidence, would be my third question. And the last one is about eviction avoidance. You've talked a lot about sort of early intervention and how it's better to stop someone becoming homeless in the first place than it is to have to deal with the fact that they are. Excuse my voice. I've not coughed, which is about as much as I've done for 2 weeks. How do we work to avoid evictions with RSLs and with other landlords? How do we identify when people are in housing arrears, for example, better, so that we can get in there? I know with discretionary housing payments, for example, we've tried to have a proactive policy because we'd rather pay a small DHP out than be left with a big problem both on a human and financial scale. Is there more we can do to try and avoid evictions, especially with RSLs? I think that's all my questions, but I would just like to say again thank you for such a comprehensive report and for the commitment that you all seem to have to this work. It's very much valued.
Thank you firstly for those comments, and I'll try and answer the questions as best I can. If I pick up on the connectivity with RSL partners and indeed touch as well with a little bit towards the private rented sector in terms of addressing some of those issues and concerns that have been raised. Firstly, there's a lot of real proactive work that goes on within RSLs in order to sustain accommodation and thereby prevent those evictions and to proactively work with individuals to address those issues. They're on the ground. Particularly, I know there's been huge success in some RSLs across Wales in terms of turning that juggernaut around in terms of the rate of evictions for rent arrears. One thing I'm particularly keen on is having common approaches for a range of things. In terms of the partnerships that we have, we've got a common housing register, we've got a common process for accessing support within the borough. For me, it's about how we have a common process around how we're addressing rent arrears with our partners and what assistance we can provide. One thing that I'd be keen to look at over the next few months is in the discussions with RSLs through the forums we have, is how we have a pre-action protocol potentially developed with RSLs so that we can be clear that where their engagement has failed, we can get engaged in because we're a different organisation, or we can get a third sector organisation, voluntary sector organisation, support provider engaged. And if we've tried everything and it still fails, then fundamentally the safety net's there in terms of homeless provision. But if we're getting it right, then that should actually then elicit that change. That change in terms of the number of evictions that are happening, increasing the rent roll that RSLs require in order to keep their business going, and equally keep people in the communities they need to be in, within the support networks they have and around the family that's there. You can apply the same sort of principles to the private rented sector around the engagement, and I think there needs to be a change. And again, I'd reference the work that Welsh Government are doing around reviewing bond schemes and reviewing the work that's there, and potentially look at how we support landlords, so almost like a landlord support service that is offered to landlords to give that confidence within the sector, not just landlords but also agents, that we can be there as the local authority or as a voluntary sector agency delivering a service for them as much as in partnership with the RSLs. Welfare reform, I wholeheartedly agree, it's one of the key issues that have been there in terms of creating financial pressure on households. We have, on speaking to the Richard Davis in Benefits, my return, there are a number of individuals who've had DHPs for a number of years in the borough. Quite simply because there's no accommodation to move them on to because they're affected by the bedroom tax. Bedroom taxes or the under occupation charge, however you want to badge it, has long gone. In terms of what would I fundamentally, what would one of the key changes be? I would certainly be advocating for not necessarily universal credit to be removed, but certainly housing costs to be removed from universal credit, because it overcomplicates an already complicated system. It creates confusion for individuals, and it also doesn't allow you to do things locally with a little bit of creativity with the funding that's potentially there and to work better with landlords. It would alleviate some of those concerns that were referenced by Councillor Kemp earlier in terms of those pressures that are there around the private rented sector. The work with churches is vital for me in terms of going forward. It was just referenced a moment ago as well. The work that we'll need to continue to do in terms of sustaining the night shelter going forward is an option, but the other things we're looking at will obviously increase that supply. So I'm particularly keen with addressing some of those issues, but if I were to change one thing, it would be to remove housing benefit or housing costs from universal credit. It's been top of my wish list for Christmas for a number of years. I've still not seen it.
Sorry, can I just add one more comment? What I was really impressed with when I sat with the team and got to know their work a lot more was the work of the financial inclusion officers. They are very proactive working with individuals. Some of those cases where they're uncovering big gambling debts, debts with potentially loan sharks. So they really do support those individuals. They negotiate with companies to write off debt, to reduce debt, to agree payment programs. They support people to access the right support around addictions as well. Some of that might be linked to drug, alcohol, but also online. Certainly from the conversations I've had, increase in online gambling and the debts the impact that's having is a big issue, not just in Torfaen, but right across the UK. So there's some real proactive work there. Also the work from supporting people in keeping those tenancies, making those tenancies sustainable, around some of those basic skills of budgeting. Some people are moving into households that they've never managed a household before. So we also offer that kind of support from our contracts with supporting people. Sorry to...
Yeah, just to finish off the points. On the eviction avoidance, I actually met with Bronavon just yesterday to talk about evictions and rent arrears, and I'm happy to say that they were very, as usual, very receptive and very constructive. And we'll be meeting again over the coming weeks to talk about this in greater detail. On the issue of communications to the public, that is a perpetual issue really, because I can't see it ever not being a perpetual issue, because I think the difficulties are inherent in that the work that you guys do, the work that we do, can't always be communicated to the public. So and that can bring with it the issue that it looks like nothing's happening or nothing's taking place. And of course, that's very difficult for us to rebut without stepping into the region of kind of data protection. So it's always going to be an issue. We'll try our best. We've tried some videos, and we will try social media sort of campaigns to kind of highlight good practice and the work that Cornerstone are doing. I mean, suffice to say, I think some of the dialogues that are online can be very unhelpful, particularly when you're identifying a rough sleeper and their location. But yeah, communications is always going to be an issue. On the armed forces points, because I'll pick that up, I think quite rightly ex-armed forces are prioritised through our emergency accommodation and temporary accommodation, and rightly so. I think a political point here, I think that the real work needs to be done at Westminster, to be honest with you, because I think that when you look at the fact that a disproportionate number of rough sleepers are ex-forces, I think that's disgraceful. And I think that there's all sorts of issues there, mental health, PTSD, that just aren't being dealt with post-service, and that clearly needs to change, because it's we're leaving people, we're churning people up and leaving them in incredibly vulnerable situations and not terribly resilient. So that needs to change, and there needs to be a greater prioritisation of mental health amongst ex-service people and existing service people. On the issue of welfare, I went to a presentation with Julie James last year, and there was a study there presented by Cardiff University report, which indicated that if there was any single thing that any of the governments, local, national, Welsh, could do to really reduce the future incidence of rough sleeping, and that is to cease welfare reform, cease any further welfare changes, and that could potentially prevent the number of the percent. This could make a 47% difference in homelessness figures by 2041. UK government have in their manifesto, they had a very admirable pledge to end rough sleeping by the end of this term, so 2024. And I would really hope that they would consider this as a big part of the solution for attaining that ambitious and laudable pledge. So, and I think I just want to cap off Councillor Thomas, the point about referring in and rough sleepers' access to services. Cornerstone started to answer that point, and I think I'd like to answer from a first-person perspective in that I've seen that Cornerstone have acted as advocates for some very, very difficult rough sleepers, some very, very tricky to work with. There's trust issues there. These guys have effectively built up a relationship with those rough sleepers to the point that they trust them, and that they then can refer on to other agencies which they might otherwise be sceptical of. So in terms of them accessing services, these guys are the gateways to those services. So financial inclusion being one of them that Jill's already mentioned. And those services, those wraparound services, and we do have a considerable number. We had a welfare reform seminar prior to Christmas, and I hope that demonstrates that we do have a lot out there for people. And they are all collectively part of getting people back on their feet and getting them sustainably on the road to recovery. So, and Hugh's point, and I think a couple of others' points about the rough sleeper count, I think we've got unity across the room in that it's not fit for purpose at all. I participated for the past 3 years, and it really is potluck. You've got a 2-hour window, and there were some instances where we'd found an encampment that had clearly recently been vacated, but and we tried our best to locate them, but you couldn't find them, but you knew that they were there. So it's a flawed methodology. Very happy to communicate that to the Minister, to say, it is helpful on one level, but we can do better. So very happy to feed that on.
Okay, so next, and then Louise.
Thank you. Simon, I'm very encouraged by your report. I've got 2 issues I want to raise. There's been a lot of discussion this morning about complex needs and issues such as substance misuse, mental health issues, criminal background. One of the worries for local residents is if rough sleepers set up in children's park areas, there's a potential safeguarding risk, and I'm thinking of young people that use parks. How is this handled? And I know Anthony and I know David has already touched. How do we, on communication, how do we reassure residents that any risk is being mitigated? That's my first point. The second point is more around partnership working. I sit on the Public Service Scrutiny Board, and there's been a lot of discussion about partnership working. One of my frustrations with public service boards is there's very little evidence of pooling of budgets. Very little going on. And there's quite a lot in this report about lack of funding. So it's an observation, really. This is a big issue that I think the public service boards should be looking at. And I just wondered if you had any thoughts on that. Thank you.
Okay, in terms of the first issue around the safety of areas and the issues that will be there in terms of people sleeping rough in public spaces, it's a huge concern. It's a huge concern when you walk around the city areas and you've got individuals ensconced in doorways, you've got concern of individuals being in parks. There are very close links with community safety, and obviously issues that are then born out of the outreach services that Cornerstone have will feed that back. So it's within that multi-agency forum that's in place, the Rough Sleeper Group. It will be about one, supporting individuals, but also addressing those issues that can be there for the community. So trying to keep people safe. It's a paramount concern across the board, one, the individuals, but also other residents. The issue around budgets is always a sensitive one whenever you get discussing about who's going to pay for what, when and where. I think I alluded to the issue in my presentation around homelessness is often seen as a housing issue. Fundamentally it is, but there are a range of things that go to driving homelessness and driving people into homelessness. And to drive out of it, you need to have that collective buy-in. Now, whether that's with actual direct funding or through having staffing as a contribution to actually addressing those needs that are there, is something that we need to wrestle with. Now, there's a lot of examples of this joint partnership working across the UK, across Wales, and we are getting to grips with that in terms of jointly commissioned teams. If I look at things such as the Torfaen Young Person Support Service, TIPS, that is a jointly funded service. So it can be done, it can be delivered, and it can produce real positive outcomes, which TIPS does. There's no reason why these issues can't be sort of resolved. No reason why we can't look at pooling those resources. And when I use resources, it's not just about the cash that's involved. It's about the staffing resource to co-locate and co-link services. But fundamentally, it is about having those pathways and working together in terms of understanding what everyone's role is. That, for me, is a fundamental starting point, and one that I think, in terms of the PSB, the Area Planning Board, we've got to look at. Equally, that goes beyond when we look at regional partnerships that are there in regional work, because that's something that then within the regional homeless strategy we've been dealing with, addressing and looking at different regional initiatives that we can take forward. That, you know, there's an issue there around economies of scale, is the use of the limited grant funding that we have through Housing Support Grant to have schemes that run across 2 boroughs. So there's little conversations that are going on in the fringes. Again, I'd allude to the point that these things aren't necessarily always seen. It's stuff that goes on behind the scenes, and it's all about officers working on the ground together and delivering those different outcomes and those different directions.
Yeah, I'll just sort of come in on the Public Service Board point, actually. It's not really fair to ask Simon to answer that one. I'm sure the leader would agree. I completely agree with you that there is a real issue about core funding for public service boards. There's, of course, there's huge amounts of money going into regional partnership boards, and more the emphasis is moving into early intervention and prevention, and I think that might possibly be the forum where there's sort of more rich pickings around investing in housing as part of that. We have had quite a few discussions at our Public Service Board about the fact that we can't fund even quite small initiatives without going around with a begging bowl to all the partners trying to get money out of them. I would say, in the defence of the local authority, that we probably put a great deal more in financially and in terms of officer time than certainly some of the other statutory partners. But I completely agree with the point that you make.
Yeah, and can I also agree? I think it's a very good point. This is an issue that is ripe for public service boards, and in that it is a whole public services issue. The work that Cornerstone and officers do has at least as much benefit for the health service, for example, as it does for any other public service, because by getting people into housing, you're improving their both physical and mental health, and you're improving lots of things. My frustration sometimes when maybe that isn't recognised when there's work that needs to be funded. I very much respect the fact that the health boards have operations to fund, but unless they too start looking up the chain of how to prevent people falling into situations which lead to long-term systemic ill health, then we're just forever going to be chasing that spiral. So I very much agree. It's something that I think public service boards should, take real cognizance of, because we've got public service board partners like Bronavon and Mellin, for example, in Torfaen, who are very actively engaged in this. We need to work together because we're not going to solve this alone.
Thank you, Simon, for the report, and Cornerstone for some really good work. There's a couple of questions, but also I wanted to ask an opinion from the both of you, really. Homelessness is demographic, and I know personally we have at least 4 individuals from Torvine that's currently in Newport, because obviously there's a homeless community. So they travel from here because they get more support and then they're together. But then when they're out of area, then they go down the route of they're not able to access the help because they've got no ties with, so they're in Newport Borough, because obviously this time last year I was out about 2 or 3 times a week, but not as a councillor, as an individual in Newport and Cardiff, and you're looking at 70 to 90 people a night, you know, and it's really, really is sad. But the biggest thing for me personally, I think, it is housing them, but it's the drug misuse and the alcohol and PTSD, because you can't put someone in a house. Everyone is different. If they don't want to be in 4 walls, and that's the biggest thing. We are lacking on the support for the mental health and the drug misuse. I've got one individual and he's got £100 a day drug habit. So he can't get a job for £700 a week just to feed the drug habit, then to pay rent, then gas and electric. So he needs to beg to pay the money for the drugs, and it's just a vicious circle. And to see it, it's heartbreaking, really. But I've got to the stage now is Newport, for example, we've got 5-6 nights a week. The community groups and support groups that's out every single night of the week, feeding, hot food, clothes. They give them bags to take away. We've done fundraising, currently trying to get a homeless bus set up. But are we supporting the homeless on the streets? They don't want to go to you for help because they know, oh well, so and so will be down tonight, and we'll have a hot. They can beg all day for the money for the drugs and the alcohol, and then they'll know in the evening time, I've got clean clothes coming, I'm fed every night. So are we obviously, it's human nature, we want to help, but are we doing we must help, because like I say, this time last year when we had the really, really cold weathers and people were out in -7, I know the one night that we were out with blankets and whatever. So that's the one question I wanted to ask, obviously, from the professionals. What do we do? With the community groups, are we stopping these individuals from accessing professional help? Well, that's it really. But we've touched on the other things. Thanks very much.
Hi, Reece. It's a really valid point, to be honest. The community groups, seeing the passion that people have got in these communities is incredible, and it's heartwarming. And sometimes it's the only conversation a rough sleeper will have that day, so the power behind it is crucial. However, my personal view, this is not representative of the local authority, is that it can be a barrier to encourage someone to engage in services that will progress their personal situation. So what we try and encourage people to do is do it within what is agreed within the community. I'm not currently funded to work in Newport, but I'm aware of the issues. In the areas that we work in, we encourage community groups to join with the churches that have been mentioned, to get involved at the night shelter, just to encourage people indoors. We've then got to work with them intensely, and all community groups can assist with that. This isn't just about the local authority, this is a joint effort with everyone. As for individuals who, you say from Torvine gone to Newport, I think people generally tend to congregate in the cities, believing that the support levels are higher. I don't agree. I think in Torvine the services are far more robust here now than they've ever been, and there's probably more on offer here than there are in Newport for the sheer numbers. When it comes to the best way I feel that people can help, and as a group of members, would be if you see a rough sleeper, wherever they are, however annoying or messy they may be at that moment, it's their home. And we can't ever forget that whether we feel someone's home is messy or not, it's their home, and that's how they perceive it. And it's a case of us, when we're doing our outreach, we moan. We're like a mother hen, clean this area up. We work with community safety if we feel there's a more fundamental issue about dangerous mess. And they help respond with us, with cleansing, with Gwent Police. It's a huge issue and it's different every case, every area. But, as I say, my view is if the community groups can work with us, I'm more than happy personally to come along, talk to any community groups and actually encourage them the best way that I believe will bring the best outcome for an individual rough sleeper.
Just from a local authority's perspective, I would echo the comments that Andrew's made. There's a lot of value in the voluntary groups that are out there in terms of delivering services and support to individuals, and I wouldn't discourage that. What I would encourage is that joined up approach that Andrew's alluded to, in the sense of linking to the churches and the approach that the local authority has. We've got an opportunity here because we're at the start of a journey in terms of bringing the different models in terms of working with Cornerstone, in terms of working with the new night shelter and the other provisions that we're looking at and considering, to actually build something together and collectively with the communities and the residents that are out there. There's an opportunity to get those messages out. And admittedly, it has to be done in a sensitive way, in the right way. But for me, it's about doing things together so that we're on track, that everybody's working together to alleviate that issue that we're seeing in front of us. If we start to do that in that sporadic way, as tends to happen in some of the larger urban areas, it defeats some of the objects of that core service. So we have to keep the core together, and then we'll be able to move forward and make that difference. And hopefully then we should see a reduction in the number of people that we're seeing at crisis point.
Okay, I got Colette and Stuart, and then Dave Thomas and Hugh.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. On 6.5, temporary accommodation review, I'd just like to know about the temporary accommodation. Is it family accommodation? I understand it's out of 2 places out of borough. Can you tell us how often they are inspected? And the other point I'd like to raise actually is about the adverse weather policy. I wonder whether this ties in with the pop-up night shelter. We're saying there that at times of extreme cold weather or hot weather, I'm concerned really about the really wet weather we've had lately. With climate change, we seem to be having more wet weather and storms than we do cold weather. I'm particularly concerned about a group of young people who were homeless in a local park. They were there for quite a few months actually in really horrendous storms. So I just wondered how this policy fits in with that.
Okay, if I can take the question around temporary accommodation firstly. Temporary accommodation provision across the county, we've got a range of provision. We've got accommodation in Nethercourt, which traditionally been referred to as, when I was last year, was a hostel. It's effectively 14 units of accommodation across flats. So that's there. That's provision that the local authority has. We then lease approximately around about 51, 52 properties from private rented sector landlords across the area. Now that ranges from a shared house, a 1-bed flats, 2-bed flats, 2-bed houses, 3-bed houses. I think we've probably got 1 4-bed house. And they're typically on lease arrangements of between 3 and 5 years in the main. A range of properties scattered throughout Torvine, so some in the south of the borough in Cambran, some to the north of the borough in Blenavon. The B&Bs, that we have no B&B accommodation in Torvine that's used, so we do end up using B&B accommodation in Newport and another unit that's out of county in Blaenau Gwent, which is something we're moving away from in terms of the provision of that accommodation with those 2 private landlords. Should give us a more robust service and more further options. What we're doing in terms of the provision that we have, we're reviewing that in terms of whether have we got enough, have we got the right accommodation, can we procure alternative pieces of accommodation from private landlords, do we need to change some of that portfolio that we've got, because some of that accommodation's been with us quite a while. Probably needs to be reviewed and looked at in terms of its potential strategic relevance, I guess. the accommodation we've got in the main satisfies the need that we're seeing, but we have got this additional need we obviously have in terms of those individuals who are sleeping rough. Hence the partnership with the private landlords on a slightly different footing. So we're reviewing that. In terms of inspections, staff are at properties on a frequent basis. Now that will vary based on the nature of the individual who's placed in that accommodation. So for example, at Nethercourt, we're there pretty much at least once a day in the week. In the weekend it's an out of hours service if there are issues there. In the dispersed accommodation, it will depend on the nature of individuals. If individuals have got higher support needs, there'll probably be a more frequent regime of visiting that individual either through a support worker or through the accommodation officer who looks after the properties. So it does vary greatly. We've got a contract in place for maintenance with a local provider, local contractor, does all the maintenance that are there, so all the gas safety and electrical checks, along with all the repairs that are done. Landlords retain responsibility for undertaking major structural works. So if the roof blows off in the storm you referred to, the landlord has to put that right. It's if you like, a non-repairing lease. If there's a leak underneath the sink, the landlord has to make that right. So we're there to cover the general routine maintenance in terms of getting a property ready. So maybe a property clean after a property is vacated, things like that. In terms of the adverse weather plan, we are looking at reviewing that because we have seen some very, very extreme forms of weather over the last, I'd say, year to 18 months that have been quite concerning. And I know when I came into post here, it was one of the first things I was looking at and discussing was around, well, what are our parameters? What do we do? How do we deliver that? And the adverse weather plan that's there does take account of those hot spells where we make sure people are kept as safe as we can in terms of water and different sunscreen that's provided, hats and everything else, as well as getting people off when it's getting people off the streets when it's cold. But equally, those bad spells of weather that could prove a risk, we need to take probably a slightly different view in terms of the plan, review that going forward and have a look at what steps we need to take, particularly if somebody's pitched up and sleeping rough and they're close to a river. And if there's an issue of flooding, we need to be mindful of that. The current plan doesn't take account of it, but officers will use their discretion and, dare I say it, an element of common sense to take steps to remove somebody from that situation. So they're the kind of things that we're looking at.
Thank you very much for your presentation, and thank you, Andrew. I found this really, really interesting, and I was interested in the element about communities and HMOs. We all got that problem, and it's something that we walk straight into in planning, because obviously we have to get planning on that. What I'm interested in, it says in here about communities and engaging communities, obviously with education, etc. You've got a dichotomy between planning need, shared planning is what I'm talking about, shared planning need and housing need, and how you get that over, because obviously there's a NIMBYism type attitude towards this, and a lot of communities care very greatly what Louise said about people being one and other people, and we're all, I think, into this one, the need for people, homelessness and people rough sleeping, but there is also an element of vigilantism about this as well. We don't want them around here. So how we engage with people and how we actually get them into accommodation and they're over there. And I've had elements of that, of various things that I'm engaged with, where there's some, and people are very, very caring as well. It's an interesting dichotomy between prejudice and whether that be people sleeping in houses or whatever, homelessness. Now, what I think is an opportunity that maybe we're missing with planning even, but it's not a planning issue, it's a house. We get said in planning committee, and I fell foul of that on previous planning committee, people well know that, but I wanted to be positive about what we're doing, and I need your guidance, or maybe your help, or maybe it's an opportunity for you people doing that, to be able to use that problem as an opportunity to engage with it, which I think you said in the previous answer.
Yeah, it's a really difficult. It's almost one of these things that you sat on the seesaw very, very crudely, and it can swing either way. I think from my perspective, there's a lot that goes on in communities that we don't see as officers. Over the Christmas period, I'm aware of a colleague in another area that was dealing with a case. They phoned me for a quick bit of advice, and a family actually took an individual from the street into their own home over Christmas. Complete stranger. That's something that I've heard of before, but it's still it shows a passion that communities have and individuals have to help people when they're in crisis. What I would say is homelessness is not just a Christmas period, it's 365 days a year, so we've got to be mindful of the provisions that we have and to build an infrastructure that delivers that for 365 days a year. Because homelessness can happen at any time to anyone, in any place. The issues around the planning and housing and the demand and supply, we have a difficulty in Torfaen because we don't have an abundance of land to develop on, per se. We have limited levels of social housing grant to do the development, so we've got to think cleverly around how we develop and deliver affordable accommodation options. Touched on the private rented sector, that's one option, and we need to work better with that sector in terms of bringing landlords with us, putting the safety nets in. And I really get the issue around HMO accommodation and the concerns that residents would have. However, the work that we're doing with the two landlords that Councillor Daniels referenced is very much about having an extremely supportive and tight management service around that accommodation to make it work, so that within the communities, if there are issues, we can respond to them very quickly. So, from my perspective, that is the key in managing that accommodation. That type of accommodation is having the right management service and support service around the individuals, but also around that landlord, so that it's not just left to one person to pick up the thread.
Okay, members, just looking at the time, I've got 5 more speakers now. So my proposal is that we take those and then move to the recommendations, just because obviously overview and scrutiny will be coming up and everyone will be wanting to have a quick break before we go on to that. So, okay, I've got Dave Thomas next.
Thank you, Chair. Just a question on 8.4 of the report. Starts on page 9, concludes on page 10. It was just about Hales House. So we wanted some more information about Hales House, and in particular how the project helps rough sleepers.
Hales House is a scheme that's specifically for young people. So there will be individuals who would be at risk of rough sleeping or have slept rough who would be within that age grouping. It's not specific accommodation for individuals who are rough sleeping. In fact, in Torfaen we don't have any direct access accommodation as is provided in, say, Newport or Cardiff or, say, Swansea for rough sleepers or individuals who are homeless on that day. It is very much based on a supported housing model, so there are very much supported housing schemes rather than dedicated like hostel accommodation or provisions such as that. So it does have a role to play, and Hales House has been a huge success in addressing potentially youth homelessness, to the extent that I don't think we've placed any young person in B&B accommodation for a significant period of time in Torfaen, which is very different in other areas. So that's been a huge shift in terms of that. So in terms of the supported housing provision, Hales House does provide that buffer, if you like, for those individuals within that group. Doesn't necessarily have that direct causative link to rough sleeping. That's the one thing I would say. But it will have an impact and to reduce that need.
Okay, got Hugh next.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair, for permitting me to come back in again. I would like to pick up on a couple of points made by the leader and Councillor Daniels regarding the Armed Forces and the Armed Forces Covenant. Both of them mentioned that we've, in Torfaen, the Council should be commended for going above and beyond the spirit and the word for word of that provision in terms of the statutory obligations of the Housing Act Wales. With that in mind, what I would like to ask, Councillor Daniel said about the failings of UK government, and I take on board that far more needs to be done in terms of mental health support for our veterans. It's been a historical issue that dates back hundreds and hundreds of years to the Napoleonic Wars, but that's why we've seen the increase in more charities like Help for Heroes, Royal British Legion and SAFA and others coming to the fore. For non-veterans, people that don't have any military experience, there is assistance when you come out of the armed forces. As a serving member myself, you do get assistance with and advice with relocation and retraining, particularly if you've been in a particular trade or branch of the services. And that assistance varies depending on the branch of service that you're in. The criteria guidelines are through the Ministry of Defence, actually, rather than the UK government. But there's a very valid point there in terms of the rehabilitation that you get is not necessarily adequate. You might be resettled and relocated, but you might not necessarily have gone through successful rehabilitation for that transition from military life into civilian life, and it is a big transition, and especially when you don't have that network of support there, that comradeship that you have whilst you are a serving member. The government now, with armed forces members, when they're leaving a branch of the services, they're currently issued with a veterans card, and obviously that veterans card would be able to help people when they come, for example, into Torfaen and ask for assistance. That veterans scheme is being extended not just to people who are immediately just left the services. It's being extended by the government to include all veterans that have served for various branches of the armed forces. Now, what I wanted to ask was, we've got in the report and under the statutory obligation, ex-service personnel who have been homeless since leaving the forces. What I wanted to ask is whether Torfaen would recognise these veterans cards going forwards when they're presented by veterans, and it's not just the immediate period of homelessness potentially after discharge from the services. Issues like PTSD and mental health issues can take months or even years following the discharge from that branch of the armed services for it to materialise and manifest itself into a serious condition. It can be relationship breakdown, domestic breakdown, it can be years after the discharge from the armed forces. So I'm asking, in the spirit of going above and beyond the legislation and in recognition of the Armed Forces Covenant that Torfaen have adopted, one, whether we will recognise this veteran's ID card going forward and extend the period of homelessness, so it's not just immediately after discharge from that branch of the armed services.
I'd be more than happy to get together a group to discuss what we could do. I know I only have second-hand experience as a family member of people who've gone through this. I know there's other members of the council who have first-hand experience of becoming an armed forces veteran, so I'm more than happy to meet with any members, as I'm sure David would be, to discuss what more we can do.
Faye next.
I'd like to thank everyone for this presentation and all the work that's going on out there. I do think it's wonderful, but I just wondered, could you give us a breakdown of where the real gaps are in provision? And taking that question further, how many children do you think that will lack are showing up as homeless or on that homeless statistic? And can we do more to get the message about homelessness and looking after ourselves and things into schools?
Okay, I have to come back to you with a figure around the looked after children numbers that we have. Just go through the records in terms of who's been presented. So I haven't got that data to hand. I don't think the information will be exceptionally high, but equally it will cause some concerns, because obviously there are some complexities that children have had in terms of sustaining accommodation, much the same way of what we've been discussing here today around individuals presenting to us. In terms of the gaps in provision, that's a very, very good question. We have a distinct gap in terms of the provision across all forms of affordable accommodation across the county. That's not helping in terms of move on from temporary accommodation, where some individuals can be waiting as long as 18 months to move from temporary accommodation into a permanent home, which is unsettling. People can't settle, they can't develop roots, and they're probably uprooted from their communities and away from family support. So that is a gap, and one that we need to work on. We do have a lack of overall supported emergency provision, hence why we're looking at the partnership with the two private landlords and coming up with a slightly different model. That is a concern when we're going forward in terms of addressing and being responsive to that immediate need. They are probably the two largest gaps that are there. The other that I'd say is particularly prevalent is potentially around the provision of supported living arrangements. So supported living for a range of different individuals. Predominantly, I suggest maybe young people, where perhaps Hales House does provide a solution. It provides a accommodation, doesn't necessarily provide a home, which may be somebody who's just been evicted from the family home and has always lived in a family home and been made homeless at, say, the age of 16, would perhaps benefit from being in a family environment. So I would suggest that another significant gap would be around the provision of supported lodgings, which would be a spare room in somebody's home that would provide that safe, supportive environment, rather than a large-scale supported housing scheme. So it's about having that variety of options that are there. And I'd say that for me, it's part of a wider agenda going forward in terms of how we identify those gaps provision and we find a different solution.
So one thing that sprang to mind when we were talking about gaps in provision, and from an observer's point of view, is mental health. I think, it's quite clearly there's not enough service provision out there. I think people are expected to wait far too long and aren't seen for long enough and often enough. I think for me, mental health is certainly one of the principal gaps I think we've got, and we've got to work with health to bridge that gap, because I think it's ultimately the key to households, individuals' resilience in getting back on their feet or not becoming homeless and rough sleeping in the first place. So I think mental health is something we've got to get right. In terms of looked after children and vulnerable children, I appreciate we'll come back to you with the points, but I happen to have done a bit of research last night on this particular subject, and it shocked me actually, because 1 in 3 care leavers become homeless in the first 2 years of leaving care, and that statistic was quite. I didn't know that. And I think that highlights, alongside another statistic, which is 27% of single homeless have been excluded from school. I think those two statistics really highlight that this is much bigger than a housing-only issue. This is much bigger than one department only. This is in terms of early intervention prevention, this is a wide agenda. And the point where we need to be intervening is clearly children and young people. Childhood poverty is by far the biggest determining factor of whether somebody becomes homeless when by the time they reach 30. Poverty. That is, and geography, adverse childhood experiences as a teenager, including social exclusion, drug use, being in care, early adult experiences, leaving education early, unemployment, renting, illness, disability, social relationship with parents, partner, children. These are all the key to preventing that demand, and it is, it's further down the line than we are expected to look at with yearly budgets. However, it's something we've got to do. So I hope that adds to your question, even though we haven't had figures, but we will come back to you for those. Should also say, Simon's been stood up for nearly 2.5 hours now, so I want to recognise that. That is an achievement.
I've got Mandy next, and then Rob as a finisher.
Thank you. Yeah, just coming on the last point, I know the corporate parenting panel look at the figures regularly, and the When I'm Ready programme helps keep children in care, staying in their foster placements, whereas they would have left at 16. And the work that TIPS are doing with the budgeting and supporting young people to find accommodation and to remain in accommodation, they do a lot of hard work. Just going back on I welcome the review on the temporary accommodation. I've got another court in my ward. We've got 14 units. It's not fit for purpose. That is, when you say about making the management and getting the right mix of management, it's also getting the right mix of people having to go into the accommodation. We've got families with young children, and we've got young people with mental health problems, drug problems, all staying in 2 blocks, very close together. And the community engagement, I think that's needed to do a review and possibly a different type of accommodation altogether. Along with very high service charges in these places where they haven't even got a washing machine. So they're struggling on universal credit, having to pay these service charges and can't do any washing. So that's really important, I think, going forward. And more engagement with private landlords. I know we've got some very, very good landlords who are very caring, and it's not all about the money, but we've also got some very notorious landlords who the state of the house isn't up to standard. You open the door and you can smell the damp, but if a resident then wants to complain, they're out. So I think more work is needed with those. Okay.
Just pick up on that point around the accommodation. It's a given as read as for myself in terms of the management. The management of any accommodation we provide has to be right to get the right outcomes. And again, touching on TIPS, we do have a housing worker base within the TIPS service that delivers a lot of effective work on the ground with a range of agencies within that service that's there, alongside mediation staff who do go into schools and deliver programmes for young people to actually educate individuals about housing, accommodation and homelessness going forward. So they're things we need to build on, enhance and be, I think, a little bit more vocal about in terms of our successes, because we often forget about that because it just goes on.
Rob?
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to finish from my perspective on a positive, if you like, at the end of the day. If you like, the main question is, you mentioned the leasing of properties, if you like. I'm interested in the smaller properties. What sort of agreement does the resident have, if you like, within that building? Is it a license agreement, or is it a short-hold tenancy? If it's a license agreement or deemed as a temporary accommodation, is that time limited, if you like? But I'm glad you pointed it out as well, because I was going to, if you like, regarding the rent a room, if you like. This is an area, knowing that some of the councillors are worried about the risk, etc. Basically, I've been renting a room for the best part of 15 to 20 years now, if you like, and specifically these days for people who are homeless. My referrals, which are coming into my home, and that's the key thing, if you like. Basically, I get through the bond scheme. I've got to make it mention good old Des from the bond scheme, if you like, at the end of the day. But the main difference between the rent room and having an agreement, because they're deemed as a lodger, they have very limited say within my house. With that in mind, if you like, the current lodgers I've got in my house, and they have got issues. The one's been with me for the best part of 5.5 years. Okay.
On the,
yes,
on the,
right, okay. But what I would say is that it is very positive in regarding the rent-a-room scheme. In regarding, I looked into having a young person staying there, and this is where possibly social services has got to look into when it comes to the adoption and fostering. Possibly it's all geared towards the family unit and not necessarily the individual who possibly could give support for that individual in a supported accommodation. Thank you.
Okay, in answer to the specific question around the leased accommodation, the leasing arrangements permit local authorities to grant one of two different occupation types. Firstly, when somebody is initially homeless and they're placed in accommodation, they will go on to what's called an excluded licence while initial inquiries are made for that first 56 days of which somebody's become homeless. That gives individuals limited rights. The authority doesn't necessarily have to go to court to gain possession, but it's good practice to do so. Beyond that point, the agreements change to what are called non-secure tenancy agreements. Now, local authorities are the only bodies that can issue a non-secure tenancy. A non-secure tenancy gives very restricted rights. It allows the authority to outright possession for any reason as such. So if we wanted to move somebody from, say, one unit to another unit and they refuse to move, we would be able to go to court to gain possession of that accommodation. There's a distinct difference between assured tenancies, tenancies with RSLs or tenancies with local authorities that have got a retained stock, where there's a level of security that's offered there, and equally with assured short-haul tenancies. The accommodation isn't time limited. Individuals could be in temporary accommodation for 18 months, 2 years. There are examples in London where individuals are on non-secure tenancies that have been there for 15 plus years, and they've been there for a long time, and they're likely to be there for even longer periods of time. So it's not time limited. What is time limited is that initial term when individuals are on what's called an excluded licence agreement. But the terms are exactly the same. They are written the same, it's just that one is an excluded licence, which changes when an obligation is known to an individual after that initial 56 days.
Okay then, if we, I think it's on page 3, the recommendation is to note the report. Do I have a seconder and mover for? Thank you. Can I have a show of hands then? All those in favour of noting the report? Thank you. I think that's unanimous, but are there anybody against? Any abstentions? No. Okay, then the date and time of the next meeting will be the normal full council meeting on the 28th of January. Okay, thank you. The meeting is closed.